Well, as relations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden continue to deteriorate, joining us to discuss the state of US-Israel relations is Gideon Israel, the founder and president of the Jerusalem-Washington Center. Gideon, thanks so much for joining us. Let me start by getting your take on the US's comments about Netanyahu. Inappropriate or justified?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has done his best to take the U.S.'s stance into consideration throughout the war, but it never seems to be enough. It never seems to be enough, whether it be the humanitarian aid and how the humanitarian aid is given and stopping the operations or pausing them, or it just never seems to be enough. And you ask yourself, what would make the U.S. happy? It seems like the more Netanyahu gives, the more they want from him. And at some point, he has to stand on Israeli interests and push back like he did.
Now let's talk about Biden's approach. Initially very pro-Israel, now perhaps a bit more politically calculated. Is the Biden administration's pressure on Israel related to elections in the U.S. or genuine concern about the transfer of humanitarian aid into Gaza?
Well, I think I kind of don't agree with that premise that in the beginning it's pro-Israel, but now more politically calculated. I think the Biden administration's support for Israel and maybe lack thereof later on in the war is all politically calculated. But I want to mention something important about the U.S. aid to Israel, as it's been brought up that perhaps the Biden administration might use the aid as leverage against Israel. Oftentimes, when people think about the United States aid to Israel, they view it as a manifestation of the United States sympathies towards Israel, or that Israel can't defend itself on its own without the U.S. aid to Israel, be it money coming to Israel, or even it be weapons sales. And I think there's a very important point that is lost in this discussion, and that is that one of the reasons the United States aid to Israel started and became institutionalized was so that Israel would have the means to fight against the Arab countries around it in a conventional way, meaning that since the Muslims outnumber Israel, it can't fight them just using conventional weapons, so it might have to actually introduce non-conventional weapons into its arsenal. The United States aid was meant to prevent such a situation where Israel would have to introduce, let's say, nuclear arms into its arsenal. And there's actually a quote from Amos Rubin, who was Prime Minister Shamir's economic advisor in 1987, where he says exactly this. It's an interview in the Christian Science Monitor, and this fact has also been alluded to throughout the years by, let's say, during the Yom Kippur War, where Ambassador Dinitz says to the United States administration that if an airlift of weapons is not going to arrive in Israel, then Israel will make the appropriate conclusions. Finance Minister Dan Meridor was part of the government in 1996. In an interview to the BBC, he said the same thing. It would be very unwise for the United States to try to use military aid as leverage against Israel. And it's important to know, if the United States wants to go down that path of trying to use military aid as a leverage against Israel, Israel will have to make serious calculations about how they fight wars, and Israel would fight wars in a totally different way. This whole idea of going house to house in Gaza or going to so much ends to try to prevent civilian casualties, if Israel knows that it doesn't have the United States back and their willingness to sell them weapons and also aid, Israel will fight its wars in a very, very different way. It will fight quick wars. It will fight wars with overwhelming force, such as the Six-Day War, and it would never, ever have a 4-month war like it has today. So I think when the United States, when we hear about aid being used as leverage, it's important to understand what the implications are.
So essentially what you're saying is that the United States, in fact, their military aid to Israel is actually helping to prevent additional civilian casualties and perhaps even a more bloody war in Gaza. Am I reading you right?
Yes, in a way, the United States is always happy to provide funds for defensive weapons such as the Iron Dome, whether David's Sling, and other things which allow for the possibility of reducing civilian casualties, but also the fact that the Israel knows that it can expect a steady delivery of munitions that it needs. That's what it allows it to fight a more prolonged war and maybe go much slower and go house to house in Gaza. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing for Israel, but that's the fact. So when politicians talk about using military aid as leverage against Israel, I'm not sure if all of them understand what the implications of trying to use that against Israel and how Israel would respond if pushed against the wall.
Forced, absolutely. Gideon, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing these insights.
Thank you. Have a good day.